Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, The Economics of De-Escalation in Middle East, organized by Al-Sharq Strategic Research. Today, we will talk about the ongoing de-escalation process in the region and try to understand the economics of it. We will try to ask whether the de-escalation is driven by economic factors, and we'll also ask how these factors could evolve over time. We will try to understand how the economic cooperation in the region could unfold in tandem with this process. We have two esteemed speakers with us to give us insights about the new economic relations of the region. Dr. Tariq Yusuf, Senior Fellow and Director of Middle East Council on Global Affairs, and Dr. Carol Nakhle, CEO of Crystal Energy. I think, first of all, we need to define what is the de-escalation process. We mean by de-escalation the improving relations between the regional powers, and especially the freeze in the conflicts between main blocs in Middle East. In the last 2 years, we have seen a rapid reconciliation process, especially between the bloc led by Qatar and Turkey and the bloc led by Saudi and UAE. And recently, there were a lot of talks on the geopolitical aspects of this process, but not much on the economics of it. So we will today first listen to Tariq Yusuf on economic motivations of the escalation process. Dr. Tariq, how do you make sense of the new de-escalation process? And do you think the economic motivations have driven the escalation? And if that is the case, which development especially changed the mindset of regional countries to focus more on economic incentives?
Thank you, Nurullah, for setting up the discussion for today's webinar, and thanks to Sharq Forum for organizing a discussion around a very important, very timely, and a very momentous subject that, quite frankly, we're all, I think, working hard and struggling at times to try to understand. I think de-escalation is the appropriate term to use to describe what has started, not this year, but very early in 2021, as you rightly pointed out, in the context of the end of the blockade on Qatar by neighboring countries. And since then, we've seen many manifestations of old foes meeting up, having discussions, bilateral visits, announcements of interest to resume cooperation and resume coordination. And the term de-escalation was appropriately coined to describe what has been happening for over a year right now. And the term was chosen very specifically because it was felt, and it still is the case, that while we're seeing a lot of mending of ties, we're seeing a cooling down of the geopolitical landscape, we're seeing a lot of tempering of competition and rivalries, we're not seeing the end of conflicts, ongoing conflicts. We're not seeing hot spots, so to speak, disappear from the region. It's as if all the problems, all the sources of instability are still there, except the actors, especially regional powers who were involved in these conflicts, had chosen to take a break from that. And I think it's important to then ask the question, why? Why in early 2021? And why has this continued? And as much as we'd like to think that economics is a big part of this, and it is, the economics or economic motives, economic incentives is not the only driver, obviously. It is not an accident that the de-escalation process started in early 2021. It was right after the election of President Biden and the coming in of the Democrats into the White House and their control over Congress. I think many regional actors at the time felt that this was going to be a very different era from the one that Trump had championed and overseen, where escalation, rivalries, and geopolitical competition intensified almost deliberately. So it was a calculation and a correct reading on the part of regional powers that the White House favored de-escalation, favored resolution to ongoing problems, and connected to that, very closely associated with that, were many, many questions, doubts in the minds of regional powers about the commitment of the US to security in the region. I'm not the first one to say this. I think everyone has observed and or have come across suggestions that the US is withdrawing from the region, or the US is lessening its commitments to the security of countries in the region, or at least the US is downsizing its presence in the region. So this was one important driver of the de-escalation we have observed. A number of other factors, before I come to the economics, have to do with the nature of conflicts themselves in the Middle East. Many other countries that became involved in the conflicts of the last decade probably wrongly assumed that these will be short-term and tightly managed adventures abroad. They turned out to be exactly the opposite. There was no clear winners in any of these conflicts, but many losers. And the end result of many of these engagements, especially through proxy actors in places like Syria or Libya or Yemen, was stalemates. Nobody prevailed. The drive by some countries or rival powers to establish a new order in the region following the Arab Spring protests of 2011 essentially did not deliver the desired outcome. And if anything, it proved to be economically very depleting, very costly, very destructive. A third factor, obviously, to add to this has to be the nature of the ideological battles we saw in the last decade in the region over democracy, over political Islam, all of which led to exhaustion, but did not deliver a clear consensus within or across countries on how to best manage politics in the region, the nature of political governance that should be promoted and supported and encouraged and incentivized. That added yet another layer of exhaustion. And last but not least, obviously, is a decade of, I would say, suboptimal economic outcomes, of very weak economic outcomes relative to the previous decade. We all recall how oil prices collapsed in 2014 and remained at lower levels than what had been observed just in the prior 5 years. This took a toll over time after 5, 6, 7 years on the budget position and the external position, not only of oil exporting countries, but also oil importing countries who had relied previously on the flow of aid and financial support, remittances. And with that was a period of weak economic growth, by and large, across the region. As if things couldn't get worse, then the arrival of the pandemic probably drove the economic costs across the board throughout the region to new heights. The exhaustion of foreign exchange reserves, the accumulation of external debt, the need to keep economies running, and in the face of a lot of socioeconomic problems within countries, rising poverty, widening inequalities, all of which drove the economic realities of the need to change, or at least the need to have foreign policies, political diplomacy, and economic diplomacy go hand in hand together. And I think it was at that moment that we started hearing across the region new slogans being shared as capturing the realities of the moment and the changed policy mindset in a lot of Arab capitals. Slogans that spoke to economic nationalism, spoke to economic interests, the need to make economics maybe, if not first, then at least on par with political and foreign policy interests. And since then, I would say the de-escalation process that started initially with bilateral visits, toning down of rhetoric, and an outreach to rivals and competitors has taken increasingly on tones of economic cooperation and interest to coordinate. And it is in this particular context that we started speaking about and seeing countries bring together in greater harmony, in greater coordination, their political diplomacy and economic diplomacy. This was the reading, I would say, that most observers had accepted until the end of 2021, early 2022. No one foresaw the war in Ukraine. No one anticipated the spectacular rise in commodity prices, especially oil and gas, but also food, that had taken place just over the last couple of months. And the confrontation between the West and Russia, the growing confrontation between China and the West, all of this adds new dimensions of uncertainty about the future, about economics, about the nature of this particular moment, whether it is a temporary phase, a permanent change in global affairs. And I think it is in this context that where we should expect continued de-escalation, not necessarily driven by clarity about the future, but by an uncertainty about the future and the need to hedge one's bets, to manage risk, to mitigate costs, and to ensure that countries, at least the oil exporting countries, will continue to benefit as much as they can from the boom in commodity prices, and where the non-oil exporting countries in the region, which are in a particularly difficult situation, can minimize the blowback from the dislocation that we're seeing in the international system. So de-escalation remains appropriate as a framework for thinking about what is happening now, but it doesn't provide us with answers regarding the future. It doesn't provide policymakers with the clarity they need. And as a result, one could expect the status quo at the moment, current dynamics, to persist for a while without clarity on what happens to regional conflicts, what happens to the regional order, whether in fact countries in the Middle East will become more integrated or less, whether they will be more Western oriented or less, whether they'll become closer to Russia, China or less. All of this is subject now to huge margins of uncertainty due to ongoing events beyond the control of most of these countries. And I think thinking about what de-escalation means moving forward should be a priority for all of us as we navigate and as countries and policymakers think through the benefits and costs, the options for economic and development and foreign policies and relations abroad. Perhaps I'll stop here and look forward to further debate and discussion in this webinar.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Tariq, for this insightful talk. I think we will need to come back to economic nationalism and the divergence between fortunes of oil and non-oil countries. But before that, I want to ask Dr. Carol to talk more on energy markets. And I think, as you stated, like for a long time, everybody was talking about the end of oil area, and post oil discussions were were done, and transition to green energy as well. But now we are talking how long these high oil prices will continue. I think we need to first talk about this issue, and in the short term, the high oil prices will have very important effect on the region. And in the long term, diversifications from oil remains a priority for Gulf countries. And the windfall from high oil prices may help that. So my question to Dr. Carol is, can Gulf countries create a win-win for everyone by increasing the cooperation and trade in the region?
Thank you very much, Nurullah, and it's a great pleasure to be with you today. And I apologize, I can see that my internet connection is not stable. Actually, I lost part of your question, Nurullah, but you can get back to me if I overlooked some of the points that you raised. First of all, well, let me start with energy markets and then this discussion about the end of fossil fuel era, let alone oil era, which were, in my opinion, rather premature and simplistic. But where we are today, as you can see, there is inflation hitting various commodity markets, particularly in developed economies as well as developing economies alike. And they are largely driven by energy and food prices. And of course, the war in Ukraine plays a major role, given the importance of both Ukraine and Russia to the global trade of grains and of energy. But to blame it all on the war is, again, another simplistic dimension, because, first of all, when you want to understand energy markets, while I know that people get excited, especially from a trader's perspective, to chase oil price movements on a daily basis, but this does not tell you where the market is heading. It pays off to take a much longer perspective and go not only a few years back, but even decades back, to have an in-depth understanding of what drove certain developments and how the situation is likely to unfold in the future. But let me be, first of all, focused on the last few years when we had the pandemic, a crisis like no other, to quote the IMF, in terms of the economic impact the pandemic has had, and its scars are still with us, and they will stay with us for many years to come. So this is where we saw the collapse in prices because of lockdown. That is an artificial containment of the demand for energy, particularly for oil. And then with fiscal stimulus and monetary policies, we saw a rebound, but that was again an artificial rebound in response to these policies. And then you add on top of that the war in Ukraine, and you have the situation that we have today. That said, when I look at it only from a few months ago, if I go back to when the war started, so when Russia invaded Ukraine, you can see how the market panicked, because we had a situation where people were worried that demand was growing quite rapidly and supplies were tight. And the supplies were tight partly because of the OPEC Plus agreement. So that's when we saw oil prices responding quite rapidly to the news about the war. And they were heading around with Brent, hitting just under $130 a barrel. And people were warning of a major energy crisis, a supply shock to the system. They were talking about a loss of 3 to 5 million barrels a day from Russian oil production. And some were predicting oil prices to go to $200 or even $300. And they're still making these predictions or these forecasts to be more accurate. However, fast forward, so from March, you can see if you compare these monthly forecasts, for example, take the International Energy Agency, their monthly oil market report, you can see how each month the tone actually was a bit more diluted than what we had in March. The fears of supply crunches were less pronounced than they had in the previous months. The scale of the loss of the barrels, how many barrels would be lost from Russia, became smaller and smaller. So somehow the market woke up to the reality that maybe there was an overreaction to a situation. There is another important element here that is demand and the fear of recession, which is becoming more and more pronounced as we progress towards the end of this year. So put all these together, realize that today, yes, the market, of course, we talk about oil prices of $100, $110 a barrel. These are not low, historically speaking, and particularly compared to the last few years. But do they reflect a massive crisis currently ongoing in the oil sector? Do they reflect that the world's second largest exporter of oil, that is Russia, is the most sanctioned? Not quite. So if I would have expected them to be much higher than that. Still, we can see that it's not just economics that are playing a role. So we saw what happened last week recently with President Biden's visit to the Middle East. I mean, they say that one picture can tell 1,000 words. The picture of President Biden fist bumping with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. So that tells you how different the world looks today from it was only a few years ago. And let me take it to 2019, for instance, when Joe Biden, who was then running for president in his campaign, promised to make Saudi Arabia a pariah state and hold them accountable for the killing of Khashoggi. Today, during the visit, President Biden described the kingdom as a strategic partner. That is a far cry in a small, short span of time from a pariah state to a strategic partner. Not only that, from energy markets perspective, from oil markets perspective, remember that the US, since last year, has been asking OPEC and OPEC Plus to put more barrels in the market. And OPEC did not respond to those calls. So they were ongoing, if I'm not mistaken, from the summer of last year. And almost every month, there were calls directed to OPEC to put more oil in the market, and those calls were not taken into consideration. And they are still not taken into consideration because Saudi Arabia did not make any promises to put more oil in the market. Actually, all along, OPEC and their allies in OPEC, what we call OPEC Plus, have always refer to the importance of maintaining market balance, the stabilization of market, which is really the mission, the officially stated mission of OPEC. So it was interesting to hear President Biden repeating verbatim the mission of OPEC, officially acknowledging the role that OPEC plays in global oil markets, just a few weeks after there was what we call the NOPEC bill, which was brewing in the US. It's still brewing, but it lost its kind of traction and its an interest in that bill, whether you would hold sovereign states accountable for manipulating oil prices. So we saw this massive shift with respect to energy markets and with respect to the major producers and net oil exporters of the Middle East. And that has, of course, geopolitical repercussions on the region, not just oil, by the way. I don't have much time to cover everything, but look at Qatar. Qatar's role today, its importance in terms of saving Europe to a certain extent from the grip of Russia in terms of gas and LNG. You can see how that has benefited the reputation and the image of Qatar. And it was going not only as a major LNG exporter, but it also as an important political a player on the political scene. And I have to say, it's not just the US that is shifting its position almost 180 degrees. Look at the EU, for instance. I mean, I understand that you are facing a crisis here in Europe, but the policy announcements that are being made seem to be detached from reality. Only, again, I take you to a year ago, not even a few years ago, to last year, 2021. In May 2021, the International Energy Agency published a report called Net Zero 2050, if I'm not mistaken. And in that report, they said that if we were to achieve the net zero targets in the next few decades, we need to stop investing in oil and gas beyond 2021. So any projects that you were supposed to invest in after 2021, you should forget about them because you don't need that if you were to achieve climate targets. And if you look at all the statements by the EU, and I mentioned the EU because they're quite aggressive on climate change policies. Fast forward after the crisis in Ukraine and the escalation of the situation and the rapid rise in energy prices, you can see how, for example, although the EU is still loyal to its targets to achieve a certain percentage of contribution of renewable energy, so they are not having a U-turn on that, but they are revisiting their plans vis-a-vis fossil fuel, vis-a-vis oil and gas in particular. And actually we see a more greater push for investment to build the infrastructure, to import more LNG, for example, as is the case in Germany, where I'm sitting now, and they want to buy LNG from Qatar, for developing greater infrastructure in other countries as well, to allow a more diversification of supplies. And see how the EU is talking to North African countries such as Algeria and Egypt and other countries as well. The problem in all this is that the difference in the time scale, and this takes me back to the Middle East. In the Middle East, you have oil and gas reserves that have very long lifespan. You're talking about, for example, the gas reserves in Qatar at current production, they would last for another 130 years around that. In Kuwait, oil reserves, almost 100 years. So the Middle Eastern and North African producers, while they would like to step in and showcase the importance of their oil and gas, but also the importance of their country to the global economy, to global, geopolitics, it's in their interest to maintain the market for their most valuable asset for as long as possible. At the moment, what they are getting from whether the US or the EU, but I want to emphasize more the EU than the US, and I'll come back to the US in a minute. But from the EU, you are hearing messages that they want more short-term fixes. So we're talking about as we want difference in the time frame. So Qatar, for example, made it very clear to Germany that they would sell them their LNG only under long-term contracts, whereas Germany fear that if they sign those long-term contracts, that would clash with their green targets and climate change policies. We do have this kind of clash. Actually, by the way, it's not just Middle East and North Africa. Even Norway kept on telling the EU, we do have gas to send you, but you have to promise that you would want that gas for many years to come. And then there was a joint statement by the EU and Norway, whereby the EU supported further investment in oil and gas in Norway, and they said they will use their oil and gas for many years to come. So we see that major shift. But let me wrap up and just say a few words on the US, because the US is a bit different from the EU on a couple of fronts. And this is where I want to go back to something that Tarek mentioned about the US moving away from the Middle East, even though President Biden at his latest visit, he said that, no, we want to be more in partnership with the Middle East and we're not walking away from the Middle East, on the contrary. But actually, it's important to look at it in terms of its relationship with the US dependence on oil coming from the Middle East. And this is where you realize that actually this kind of the US distancing itself from the Middle East started under the Obama administration. And it coincided with the development of the shale resources in the US, the shale revolution, which transformed the US from being a net importer of oil to, even if it was short-lived, of net exporter, but actually they became the largest oil and gas producer in the world. And their dependence on Middle Eastern exports has been declining since. So this kind of important factor that connected the US to the Middle East kind of weakened after the shale revolution. But today the US is wearing two hats, and this is where we saw this dilemma particularly pronounced under President Trump, former President Trump, because the US is the largest oil consumer in the world and is also the largest oil producer in the world. On the one hand, high oil prices are not good from consumers' perspective, but high oil prices are good from a producer's perspective. So the US has been trying to achieve this kind of delicate balancing act. President Trump, I have to say, was much more blunt in achieving that balance than President Biden. But President Biden is seeing his popularity declining because of these high prices that people are paying at the pump, and you have the midterm elections coming soon. And this is what at the beginning he was trying to shift all the blame on OPEC. Now he's shifting the blame on Russia, and OPEC is not anymore the bad guy. So we see a bit of chaos and confusion happening, whether on energy policy in the EU or on the position of the US vis-a-vis the Middle East. But at the end, yes, we do have a crisis in energy markets. Yes, you will have winners and losers, as is the case with any crisis, but crises do pass. And the big question I have for everyone to think about: what will happen when oil prices collapse, when oil prices go down again? Now, you may believe that this will not happen, but if a global recession materializes tomorrow, then this is going to be a more likely scenario. Then will that strategic partnership between the US and the Middle East continue? I don't know. This is a question that is subject to debate, but we should not disconnect the Middle East and North Africa from what is happening in energy markets in relationship between each other, but most importantly, between their main partners, the EU and the US, and also other players, Russia and China, but I can touch on those later on during the Q&A.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for discussing the long-term view on the energy markets. I think that's a good place to turn back to Dr. Tariq and ask about the implications of this. Like I think he has touched upon this, but so there is this diverging fortunes between oil and non-oil countries. And so, Dr. Tariq, how do you expect this to play out in the, I think, short term and in the long term?
Thank you, Nurullah. It's a very good question, and one that we all should be thinking about. The last time we had a set of macroeconomic circumstances, meaning global conditions with a lot of volatility, high inflation, and monetary authorities around the world trying to clamp down on inflation, bring inflation under control through increases in interest rates, was sometime in the late 1970s, which was also a time when oil prices were at record highs following the Iranian revolution. The subsequent few years proved to be very divergent in terms of how the two groups of countries reacted, performed, and ultimately emerged. So following the during the oil boom, a lot of the oil importing countries in our region in the Middle East came under intense pressure. Rising prices, commodity prices, but also energy prices. But they were helped to a great extent by the nature of assistance, support, and the interdependence economically between the oil and non-oil exporting countries. So we saw a lot of official aid being sent by the oil exporting countries, which were in the middle of the oil boom and enjoying a very handsome windfall initially. We saw also significant flows of remittances. The Arab workers in particular in a lot of the Gulf countries probably represented a majority of the expat community. That was a moment of what you might call solidarity within the region. Now, if you fast forward the scenario that Carol had put on the table right now, that in fact, there is a real danger that as the monetary authorities, central banks in the Western countries, try to bring inflation under control in the next few months, in the next year or two, and in the process cool down their economies, which are still growing at historically high rates, they might in fact drive the world economy into a recession, and in the process, you might see a replay of what happened in the context I've just summarized for everyone in the late 70s and early 80s. Is it possible that we will still see regional countries coming to one another's aid? What happens or what remains of the spirit of solidarity that we had witnessed at a moment in time relative to where we are today? My concern and my reading of things right now is that the oil importing countries, so the large countries in the Middle East that don't export significant amounts of oil and gas. So think of the Egypts, think of the Moroccos, but also think of countries like Sudan and Jordan and Lebanon, are going to be under immense pressure in the coming period because of economic nationalism at one level. Countries are looking after their interests primarily, and every economic commitment, financial assistance is being looked or filtered through the prism of geopolitical interests. And more importantly, they're going to feel the shocks of what's happening at the moment much faster, much sooner, and with greater impact. And things might get out of hand, and they find themselves under immense economic strain in the middle of all the uncertainties that we've talked about. Now, why does one say this? Or are we seeing any evidence of this early on? The most recent round of the Arab Barometer survey that was done just a couple of months ago, in fact, released about a few weeks ago, came out with some startling information about the impact of high food prices on households in the region. In many of the countries I have mentioned, significant segments, if not majorities of respondents, suggested that the cost of living just on food needs, basic food expenditures of your typical family have already exhausted their available resources. And we're still in the middle of the inflationary period or the wave of inflation that we're seeing today, and commodity prices are expected to go much higher in the coming period, absent some global resolution to the shortages that everyone is seeing. So who's going to step in to close the gap or to help the Egypts of the world and the Jordans and the Tunisias and the Lebanons to mitigate the very real risk that is presented, that will affect not only poverty and nutrition, but potentially also political stability, or what remains of political stability in some countries. I think it's those particular concerns now, compared to a generation ago, that are probably much more real, much more risky, and could have a much greater impact on what happens to de-escalation, and how one group of countries that Carol talked about, the oil exporting countries, stands to benefit immensely from this particular moment in economic dislocation because of high oil and gas prices, and how another group of countries is under a mountain of external debt with limited resources, feeling at the household level immense socioeconomic pressures that can be very destabilizing and very worrying. I am concerned, I would say. I'm not very optimistic. I don't think solidarity in the sense we saw a generation ago will prevail. And I don't think the oil exporting countries will come to the rescue of everyone, even if they had the resources to do so, if only because of everything that we've just talked about earlier. This is a very long-winded answer, and I should stop here. without consuming more of the time. But I wanted to get a general idea across that we should be thinking about when it comes to questions that are very country-specific or specific to a group of countries in the region. Politics is going to matter. Geopolitics is going to matter. The nature of cooperation and coordination as we see it today, and as I've tried to emphasize earlier, the wave of de-escalation has yet to deliver the kind of order, stability, predictability, deep integration that would be needed, would be necessary at a moment where a group of countries in the region is coming under immense economic pressures with significant political consequences.
Thanks, Dr. Tariq. I think these are very important remarks, and considering the concerns about food security with rising food prices, I think we need to be concerned about the points that you have touched upon. I think it is like there is this paradoxical result of the economic nationalism. On the other hand, it leads to like a de-escalation process. On the other hand, as you said, it may actually consume itself if there would not be a framework for more economic cooperation especially considering a possible crisis coming up. I will go to the related topic, and I think that is also discussed a lot about the new framework of Middle East economic cooperation, which is the Iranian nuclear deal. I think I want to ask both of you how you fit a possible Iranian nuclear deal in this picture, and can such a possible deal create a new framework for relations and increase cooperation instead of conflicts in the region? Who goes first?
Well, Tariq, I'm pretty sure this is more your scene than mine, but I have to say that I think the expectations of a deal have become much more pessimistic today than they were only a few months ago or towards the end of last year. So the prospect, even if I look at it only from an oil markets perspective, you can see how last year people were putting a figure on how much oil will come to the market if a deal is signed, is reached between the US and Iran and the JCPOA, or at least a modified version of that deal was revived. But today you can see that hardly anyone, when you look at market expectations and analysis and publications, hardly anyone uses kind of probability, because especially, and this has been particularly shown during the visit of Biden to the Middle East, because it's not anything confidential that at least the Gulf producers, the main actors there, for long believed that the JCPOA was a mistake, and to sign it and to reach a deal without touching on some crucial issues that were, from their perspective, what is threat to the region would have been another big mistake. So I'm sure this was part of the conversation and the discussions between Biden and his team and the officials in the region. But as I said, the expectations of a deal has kind of weakened a lot compared to only a few months ago. But I will let Tariq elaborate on what, if there was a deal, what does that mean for the region?
Carol, I actually think you were spot on. I don't think we have a very clear idea, especially on the economic front, as to what a deal is likely to deliver. I think the last time we had a nuclear deal, we saw heightened security concerns on the part of many of the Gulf countries. And we saw Iran escalate its very aggressive geopolitical interventions and interference in a number of theaters across the region. That created not only tensions and uncertainty, it proved also costly. It weakened the relations between the US and a number of Gulf countries. And while it didn't prove to be economically initially very costly, but over time, as these security concerns escalated and became genuine and real, we saw the Gulf countries themselves begin to extend significant amounts of resources and to double down on their own geopolitical positions. And the case of Yemen is perhaps the most well-known illustration of what happens when geopolitical competition driven by insecurity and driven by uncertainty about the international system and where your security guarantees come from, what it can do. I share Carol's pessimism at the moment about the potential for a nuclear deal to be agreed to soon. And I also do share her view that the Jeddah summit may not have alleviated any of the concerns or apprehensions that regional players have on the possibility of a deal. On the other hand, one can also observe that regional actors are not necessarily waiting for a deal to happen or not. They're hedging their bets. They are positioning themselves to potentially accommodate a deal should one happen. I think the strength of relations between some of the Gulf countries, China and Russia, are partly in response to geopolitical insecurities. The ongoing de-escalation and possibilities for normalization with Turkey is also a step or one particular aspect of this hedging approach that a number of countries have taken. And last but not least, we saw how a number of Gulf countries have actually quasi-normalized relations with Israel and have started discussing security cooperation. All of this is to prepare themselves for the uncertainty around when a deal happens and what happens following a deal. Now, there is a rosy scenario one can imagine where Iran and relations with Iran become more normalized following a deal, and the region focuses on economic cooperation, economic integration, greater, looking after the greater good, and reconciling in areas where they have differences. That is always an outcome that one should strive for, but absent a clarity on where the de-escalation is leading us, absent a clear regional order or a semblance of an order where the rules of the game and the rules of engagement are agreed to, and countries choose to also address existing conflicts and try to resolve them. Absent that, and absent answers about where the international system is heading, where the US's confrontation with China is likely to go, and how the West and Russia are likely to coexist or not at some point in the future, it's going to be the insecurities, the fears, the worries, and the risks that countries will be paying greater attention to. And as such, I do share Carol's pessimism and the larger, I would say, skepticism around what a deal could deliver now and how much it will do for regional players starting in the Gulf, but also elsewhere, where Iran and regional powers have confronted one another and fought both hot and cold battles over the last decade.
Thanks, Dr. Tariq. I think now we can start to take Q&A from audience. If you have any questions, you can ask in the chat. And in the meantime, I think like the discussion about the lack of framework and possible concerns about stability, I think one of the good examples for that is actually Lebanon. And so here we see the regional powers do not have a framework for cooperation, and they, like the country, people in the country suffering from high oil prices, high commodity prices, and so there is not a light near the tunnel that we can see for Lebanon. I think that is a good example and a concern for all of the region. We have a question. You can see in the chat. I can ask you as well. In the near future, is there any possibility between Iran and Saudi Arabia will have a tie for their common economic interests? I think we may. Who wants to go for it?
No, I'm just thinking how to look at this question. I don't know whether maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on it, Nurullah. What does it mean, a tie for economic interest? I'm just not quite sure how to interpret the question so that I would answer it fairly. But I don't know, Tarek, maybe you have a better insight into the question.
Yeah, I didn't understand.
Not at all, Carol. I mean, one way of thinking about the question is to sort of paint a scenario where one imagines reconciliation. I think we are in the zone of de-escalation right now, even if that is proceeding very slowly and very cautiously. I don't think it's a secret that Iran and Saudi Arabia have been engaged in a bilateral dialogue that has been on and off, that has made more progress in some areas, less in other. So both countries are turning down the temperature, so to speak, and what we see, the outcome, the ceasefire, this temporary freeze in the conflict in Yemen is one direct result of this. It serves both of their interests. Now, can one imagine as a world in which they actually reconcile completely and coexist and normalize relations as would be required for regional stability and for their own economic interests? Yes, one can imagine that. How do we get there? I think that's the how is a very different question from what happens then. Now, we're all struggling to think of what a regional order would look like and who's likely to emerge here as a key player. And I think it is safe to say that that regional order has to accommodate not only Saudi Arabia and Iran, but also a country like Turkey, which can help buttress any stability and provide credibility for any regional arrangements or agreements that are signed between the Gulf countries and Iran. But should this happen, and maybe this is where one feels comfortable answering the question, the economic returns from a greater integration with Iran and the Gulf are huge. They should not be underestimated. Iran is a country that has been in isolation for a couple of decades now. It's got phenomenal resources, not just human capital resources, but oil and gas. It's got bent up, probably demand for a lot of things that the Gulf countries can and should and would like to be a part of. It is not unusual in Gulf capitals to hear people speak about Iran being the big prize that everyone should strive after when stability is achieved, in recognition of its economic potential and of the neighborhood effects and the gains from helping Iran catch up with modernization and achieve the kind of economic transformation it would want to have. When do we get there? That's precisely the difficult question, and the one that me and Carol and many others would struggle with. But if we were to get there, one can paint a very rosy picture about what this would mean for everyone in the region, economically at least.
Let me add another dimension, though. I'm usually a very optimistic person. I don't know why I'm coming across today as feeling down. Maybe it's just the heat is affecting my mood here in Europe. But don't forget that if you look at OPEC market share, and if you look at the market share within OPEC, you can see that whatever Iran has been losing because of the sanctions and the restrictions on its oil has been captured by the biggest producers within OPEC, including Saudi Arabia, but also the UAE and Iraq, and maybe to a lesser extent, Kuwait. So while I can see the bigger benefit of having stability in the region and taking away this kind of risk premium, the geopolitical risk premium that we add whenever we look at the region because of the tension in Iran, but I'm also looking at it from an interesting perspective, that is oil market dynamics. How would that work out? Because maybe market shares are not that relevant when prices are high, but they become much more relevant when prices go in the opposite direction. And to bring in Iran with all its barrels to the market and have a nice relationship with Iran, it's going to be different. You may say, yes, we had that for decades because Iran was an important member from the beginning within OPEC. But the difference is that in the future, the market is expected to shrink. And it's a very different reality when you have a growing market as we have had for the last decades and a rather shrinking market as you look further ahead. So that makes it an interesting case or scenario to analyze.
Thanks a lot. A last question from audience. The question is, I think very related question, can economic imperatives be sufficient enough to overcome their geopolitical and political rivalries?
It's a great question. I think the audience is asking us the kind of impossible questions to answer in a soundbite. I think economic imperatives can be incredibly motivating and can push countries into corners where they would accept geopolitical choices that they otherwise would not. That is certainly a possibility. And let me paint a scenario here that might be an easier way of thinking about this problem. I don't think it is inconceivable that a number of countries in the region in the coming year or so could find themselves facing financial crises. These are countries that have accumulated a lot of external debt, whose budgets have suffered as food and gas subsidies have increased, and whose alternative sources of revenue might be limited, and who have every incentive to try to contain the damage from high food prices in the coming period. These countries could be pushed under the weight of this mountain of debt, high interest rates, into a financial crisis. And that might be not only destabilizing domestically for a lot of these countries, politically and socially, but it might render them vulnerable also to geopolitical concerns and interests and priorities of others. I don't think, a few years ago, this would not have been a realistic scenario. But given what we're looking at right now, in the case of a lot of oil importing countries or non-oil exporting countries, a financial crisis could be very pivotal for both domestic stability, but also geopolitical positioning and priorities.
I'm going to add to that one. I know I'm running out of time, but just my main comment would be how lasting. So yes, you may be facing a set of economic challenges today that would support cooperation between countries that have been historically not amicable, to say the least, to each other. But once those economic realities change, do we go back to this political rivalry and adversary? Because I fear that the political rivalries and adversaries they have more fundamental issues that are based on fundamental issues that may be overlooked to achieve a certain economic interest. But once that economic interest is achieved, I would say those differences are likely to re-emerge.
Thanks a lot. I think if you have last remarks, we can take the last remarks and then finish our webinar. Dr. Tariq, you can start with this.
No, I would say for students, researchers, and observers, this is an incredibly interesting period of time, one that we hadn't seen the likes of in a generation. The level of geopolitical dislocation coupled with global economic volatility, that mix is incredibly challenging for countries, for ordinary people, but it should present itself as material for everyone to reflect on and think about, and more importantly, offer the kind of advice that will contribute to bettering people's lives and hopefully also improving the trajectory of policy.
Thanks. Dr. Carol?
Yeah, Tariq reminded me of something I told my student in the UK this year when I were concluding the term. And I said, look, for example, we studied oil crises of the 1970s and later the 1980s, because I only came to this studying oil and gas and energy in general late after that. And today, yes, it's sad and very disappointing to see what's going on, but it's also for those who are doing research, for example, including students or academics or those who work in think tanks. It is a fascinating period to see how it's going to affect all those targets, for example, and the policies that were formulated and the forecasts. You see, the reason people forget that when you look at all these forecasts, the 2040 and 2050 scenarios, they were developed based on a set of assumptions that turned out to be completely wrong today. So that by itself creates a huge opportunity for research, for, if you want, resetting with a completely new lens, take into consideration the tsunami of, or what I call it, the crisis souffle that we have had since 2020 with COVID. Then you have now the war in Ukraine, which is going to affect the trade flow of energy, of food, you name it, and with geopolitical consequences as well. And on that note, I thank you very much for having me with you today. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you very much. I think it was very insightful and I learned a lot. Thanks a lot for listening us. Thanks.